Hello, everyone. We're just going to wait a few seconds for people to switch out of one event to the other, but we're very excited to see you all and hope that we're going to have a very fun session. So we're just going to give it about 30 seconds for everyone to switch in, and then I will open the session formally. Okay, I think that's about 30 seconds now. So welcome everyone to this exciting event. I'm going to introduce our two speakers in a minute. And as usual, we look forward to an interactive session. So please do use the chat area to ask questions, which we may use throughout the session or at the end, but we have plenty of time. We have an hour to hear things. Okay, so I'm just going to introduce the two speakers and then I'll introduce myself and then we will move to questions, everyone. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Andrew from iProov, who's the founder and CEO. Andrew founded iProov in 2011 and in 1999 he founded mBlox, which was the world's largest provider of SMS transmission of enterprise applications. So Andrew clearly has a very experienced background in technology and entrepreneurism. And last year, he was made Commander of the Order of the British Empire by the Queen. So he has his CBU, which is a very exciting thing. We're very excited to see Andrew here today and talk to him. Along with Andrew, we're excited to have Rod here, who is the co-chair of the Open Digital Institute from the International Institute of Finance, and that's a really important initiative. He also was formerly at Santander as the lead for digital identities. Two very, very informative, powerful, experienced people to have a great conversation with. And you are hosted today by myself, and I'm Helen Packard. I work at the Bank of England in the PRA, the Prudential Regulation Authority, and my focus is on delivering large regulatory change, mainly artificial intelligence, and also have a great interest in the subject. So as we open with that, I'm going to start with questions. So initially over to you, Rod. With your co-chair responsibility, where do you see the vision, the long-term vision for digital identity going?
ID is a really tricky thing to solve online, and it's something that without solving it cleanly and simply, we end up with a huge societal costs. If I don't know who the person is on the other end of a digital connection, if I don't know whether they're the actual person that I think I'm connecting with or a fraudster, I end up with all sorts of dangerous situations. We face globally massive fraud in the order globally of about $1.5 trillion a year. If you think about it, it's taken in the US more than 8 months of wrangling the negotiation for a government to spend that much. And yet every year we blow that much on the cost of identity fraud globally. Negatively impact everything from bullying all the way down to dangerous acts throughout the spread of misinformation. It inhibits our ability to handle crises like the climate crisis or the pandemic. It's a massive and huge challenge. I think it's the biggest challenge still unsolved on the internet today. So where do I think it's going? I think that we're moving into a new wave in identity. The first wave was pretty simple, and it happened a long time ago in digital identity. People had an identity that was given to them by the company they worked for. Here's your login and password. As Web 2.0 arrived, there were suddenly hundreds of sites that we logged on to and hundreds of IDs and passwords that we had to keep track of. That became really powerful and also really complicated to deal with as an end user. Why do I have to manage all of these things? Why can't it be something that's simple? The move to Web 3.0 with decentralized systems is also going to focus on empowering the individual. I think it's going to work like a credit card. With a credit card, you might have one or two, maybe three, but you use this one card everywhere. It's accepted everywhere. It allows merchants to transfer risk when they're dealing with you, but people know that if you present the card, you're going to get they're going to get paid. You know, as a consumer, that if somebody gets a hold of your card, your bank is going to protect you from unfair charges. There's a system in place. So what does this mean in an identity world? I mean, do we have anything like that? I think that's where we're going. I think we're going to go to this third wave where it becomes, instead of hundreds of identities, you're going to have one that you can be able to use everywhere. Personally, I believe that people are not going to get their own identity wallet and manage it all themselves, although that'll be possible. I think that most people are going to partner with an institution they trust, an institution that's going to be able to deliver that for them in a way that's simple and easy to use. It's the same institution probably that delivers that credit card for them, which is a financial institution. The challenges to solve in all of this mean that you can delegate that to the experts. You can leave to the financial institution, how do they solve questions of, is this a real person right now in front of me? And that's where I think that you'll see, at the same time that this happens, a big ramp up in the capability, the technical capabilities of companies that are supporting it. And I'm sure Andrew can tell us a lot more about that.
Thanks, Rod. That's really helpful. And I think, Andrew, it'd be great to hear your thoughts on the long-term vision. You know, I'm sure following on from Rod with his simplification and the transparency, that we would like to hear your thoughts.
So I think the future of digital identity actually is fundamental to the facilitation of the entire online ecosystem and to inclusion of people. And I think it's going to be a bit of a mess. So the universal solution that we have one identity which we use for every purpose, no matter which country or application we're in, I don't think it's going to happen because the world is messy. There are three models that we're seeing emerging in the world. One is the state-sponsored digital identity, and we see it in Singapore, for example, with SingPass, the national digital identity platform, where the state, at the beginning of your life and throughout your life, knows everything about you, and therefore the dossier of information that is fundamentally what digital identity is all about is held and created by the government, and everyone feels comfortable about that. And that kind of works in some countries, is an option in others, such as Australia, for example, and it won't be an option at all in other countries. Then you have federated solutions in which you have frameworks in which a constellation of different identity providers can set up and create IDs, and you kind of shop around and pick whoever you like. In a way, this was the method that was tried and failed, unfortunately, with Verify in the UK. It's the basis for the rather more successful eIDAS solutions that are Generation 1 eIDAS solutions. And then I think you're going to find a myriad of unconnected solutions, and we're starting to see this in the United States, where different identity providers onboard people for different use cases, and people set up multiple different identities, which they use in different cases. And then, as Rod describes, there will be a solution, and we're starting involving what used to be called self-sovereign identity, and is now better known through the idea of verifiable credentials, in which the user owns their own dossier of information and carries it around with them, and is able to assert that in different environments. For a long time, that has been a technical dream, an idea propagated more by the producers than the consumers. COVID has changed all that, because we're starting to see COVID health passes being based on verifiable credentials, and the new European regulations on eIDAS 2 are also going to be, we think, based on verifiable credentials. That changes everything. The common factor in all of these is actually not how is digital identity issued and how is it walleted, but how do I as a human being authenticate my right to assert this digital identity. Because in the end, all the digital identity is it's just a file of facts about someone. That's all. We get very bound up in it. Digital identity is a file of facts about somebody, and you can store that. You can store that, or someone else can store that. But the key central issue is how do you know that the physical, living, breathing human being, the carbon-based life form, as a customer of mine in a global government, in a national government describes us, how do we know that this carbon-based life form is the person who has the right to assert that dossier? And authentication, therefore, becomes the very heart, because that's quite difficult. It's quite difficult to set up trusted authentication credentials, and it's quite difficult to secure them. We think the heart of authentication in the future, the heart of trust in people's digital identity is going to be biometrics, because you can't lose them, you can't share them, they can't be copied, they can't be forgotten. But what really matters about biometrics is not how precise and accurate they are, because fundamentally that is almost irrelevant, but it's how easy is it, how readily can you assure that you're looking at the genuine article? Because ultimately the security power in the context of digital identity that biometrics convey is the genuine article is unique. And so we believe that that right at the very center, the singularity that lies at the heart of the digital identity galaxy is the ability to assure the genuine presence of the person when they assert one or more digital identities. And they may have several different records held with several different people, because people want to have several different identities. Doesn't change the challenge. How can you be sure that the person that is asserting the digital identity is whom they claim to be, and that they are the genuinely present human being they think they are?
That's great. Thank you, Andrew and Rod. That definitely sets us off on a vision of where we want to get to. So the question now we're going to talk about is how we could get there. So Rod, over to you initially. We've where do you see the top threats currently and in the future, on the horizon? Where are the threats to achieving this wonderful vision out there? I'll go to Rod first and then to Andrew.
Well, it's picking up on what Andrew says. It is an enormous challenge. There's living in Silicon Valley, I get to see some nuttiness around me sometimes, and crazy ideas. There's one that's come out recently in a space that I confess I don't know much about. It's in cryptocurrency, and I'm not a big expert there. But the process that the guy's going through actually really highlights the challenge, and this is in your words, Helen, the biggest challenge, the biggest threat that we have to solving this. How do you recognize the person in front of you? When I show up, when I used to show up in Heathrow, with a passport, and this is before the modern systems, I would stand in front of a border guard, and she would look at my passport. It had a picture of me inside it, and she would compare it to the person physically standing in front of her. And then she had ways of confirming that this was a real passport. And at that point, she made a decision about whether or not to let me in. The challenge now is that I'm not standing in front of her. I'm separated by an anonymizing digital barrier. How can she still be sure that I am the owner of this credential, this passport, this address, this library card, this credential from my company that says I can trade on their behalf, or this that I really work in the call center and I'm really trying to help you? How can you be sure that the person in front of you is at all created or is all associated with that? The thing that the crypto thing that I was mentioning deals with that in a way that I can't see that it scales, but I can see how it describes the problem really well. The way that they're associating handing out these coins in their wallet is to first identify you by scanning your retina. Everybody for most of their life has a consistent retina. And what they're going to do is to scan your retina. Problem is that you age, and so this may fall apart as people age. The big problem with this is that, of course, you can't do that for 99% of the people, 99.9999% of the time, because nobody's standing in front of you. But it illustrates the challenge of trying to identify somebody precisely. So, and what it does normally is to say, okay, well, if we need to do something like that to try and identify that this, for example, is really Sam, we can't do that on a normal basis. So how do we figure out how to do this in a different way, accomplish it in a different way? And that's the challenge that we have to face. How do
I'm sorry, but I've got to interrupt, because it's really important for this audience that we're clear not to conflate two different problems. The problem of identification and the problem of authentication are two different problems. And they are very often conflated, and they shouldn't be. Listen, you're right, an iris can be used to identify me very accurately. But you may as well give someone your email address. That is equally good at identifying you. The problem is authenticating that asserted identity. So if I give you my iris, yes, you can use that to identify me, but can you also use that to authenticate me? Well, then it depends. Am I looking at a genuine iris? And it turns out to be very easy to forge it.
But that's not my point, Andrew. It's not to say that it's my that you can recognize me or use my iris. It's to say that that's a very precise measure. A less precise measure, but still fairly precise, is the face. Another one that's not ideal is but can be done over the camera is the fingerprint. Another one is voice or other things. Turns out that in order to be certain that I'm really dealing with a unique person, I have to triangulate a lot of information about them. When I was running identity at one of the world's largest banks, I was looking at trying to first go through a thing of saying, is this the unique human being that I saw before? Can I recognize their face, thumbprint, fingerprint, a digital certificate or something on their phone? Can I recognize that they're on a reasonable network where I expect them to be? All of these things led me asymptotically to a point where I could say with a high probability, with never 100% certainty, that it was the same individual that had come back before. If I can be certain that this is, and we'll just put a number on it, this is individual number 1 who has come back again. Now I've got a second challenge, and we do this during onboarding at banking, which is to associate that person with credentials that come from a government. So this person really lives at this address, they really have this tax ID, they're really known officially by this name, they really are associated with this bank account. Then I can figure out what they have access to. But that two-step process of can I recognize them, and then can I reconnect them to credentials that I've established before. That's the big challenge. What's interesting about the WorldCoin is that they try to solve this challenge that I normally have to involve multidimensional triangulation with. I'm just going to scan an iris.
So one of the things that we're seeing in the world of digital identity is what you might call identity hopping. Yeah. So you start with a trusted credential, and you use that trusted credential to set up a new identity account, which is based upon the knowledge that you've just derived from that previous account. And then from then on, your task is to authenticate the person against that. And we're seeing this, and today the key source of information that is widely used, because it's so portable, are people's passports. So for example, when the Australian government sets up the MyGov ID, they use the user's passport. When in the UK, the EU settled status was setting up a settled status account, they used people's passport. Why is the passport such a good source of core trusted information? Because almost all passports worldwide today contain a biometric chip, which contains all the data in the passport, plus a photograph supplied by the government, all cryptographically signed. So the passport contains something that is pretty much a locally verifiable trusted credential. So if you can read the passport data, which you can do because almost all smartphones are capable of nowadays of reading a biometric passport, you now have trusted, verifiable information about a person's name, their date of birth, their citizenship, you even have their passport number if you want, and their photograph. Now you have their photograph, now you have the means by which to bind a physical, by which to authenticate, not identify. I'm going to take issue with this on this, Rod, because there's a fundamental difference between identification and authentication. You have the means to authenticate a physically present human being against a reference image. So once you've got the NFC read passport, we partner with various companies, including, for example, Read ID by Innovala in the Netherlands, and you do a facial verification, then even if the person is sitting on the couch, you now have the ability to set up a very high integrity, trusted identity for that person within your own particular environment.
What do you do without a passport? Because as somebody running a bank, somebody in the US, 85% of Americans don't have one.
Absolutely
I can't
true.
do anything with it.
And that's absolutely right. And there are only two answers to that. One is that you read the person's...
Scan their iris?
Because the iris doesn't tell you anything. The iris tells you nothing about the individual at all. You have your dossier remains as empty after you've scanned their iris as it did before.
Actually, that's the thing. By first starting with this thing of, can I recognize this person? I then, for most of these people, can go to a second step of saying, all right, now that I can recognize them, I agree, my dossier is empty, except for one thing. And the iris is a metaphor. Now that I can be certain that this person is individual number one, returning, I don't know anything about them. I can then go to the second step of finding out everything else about them, but finding out consistently that it is still individual one coming back. My challenge is not do I know that this is and that my fear with most of these things, my big worry before was somebody could show up with a verifiable credential, but was that individual number one or individual number two or three
Absolutely.
or four? I constantly have to be able to connect the dots between those two.
But that's the process of authentication. The process of identification, and the reason that I make them so separate is that the process of identification means that somebody turns up and you have to guess which of 7 billion citizens on the planet they are. The moment that they tell you who they claim to be, and they can do that by presenting their iris, but frankly, they may as well give you their email address. You now have to authenticate them. Now you've got a much simpler task. Now you've just got to check whether the one person who is in front of you is reliably the one person that you thought they were going to be, which is a problem that is order of magnitude, many orders of magnitude less demanding, and therefore can be done with greater security and reliability. The easiest way to find out who a person is not to look at their iris, it's to ask them, but you don't believe them. You authenticate them, but the authentication task is very different from that task. Your question of what do people do if they don't have a passport is a very good one. In the United States, what people typically today are doing is they are scanning real ID driving licenses, which is fine, except that you can change the photograph and people do all the time.
Yes.
And so technology is needed to distinguish the photograph. What's really interesting, I think, is we're going to see a world in which people, and I think we're probably about to agree violently on this, there will be identities in which you actually don't know anything about this person except their reputation. Because you have no identity, their dossier is empty apart from their history of activity, providing that you can authenticate them to make sure that whoever they are, it's always the same person who booked into an Airbnb, bought this, did that other. After a while, they build up a track record that altogether is, if you like, the social basis of trust. No, but the one thing you can be certain of is you're always dealing with the same carbon-based life form who created that track record. And they may be identified, as you said, by an anonymous pseudonym. There are a lot of people in this world who don't want to be tracked and controlled and monitored by the government. And yet, if one deprives people of digital identity because of that, then they are at the same time disempowered and excluded. That's why I'm a huge believer in saying, look, if somebody attaches their face, even to an anonymous identity, and then uses their face every time they come back to assert that identity, you have empowered them, even if you never know and are never capable of discovering who they are, because you're using their face to authenticate them, not to recognize them, and you're giving them pseudonymity.
That's right. Please, Helen, go ahead.
I think we're having a wonderful debate. This is exactly what we wanted. Two very passionate people, very knowledgeable people. Before we move on to the next question, we do have a question from the audience that I think is pertinent to bring up. How would you describe the current regulatory landscape? So when we're talking about that vision, those threats that are on the horizon and today, you know, does the regulatory landscape fit in that world as part of the opportunities, the threats, and so forth? You know, when we think about self-sovereign identity, open source solutions, you know, where does it fit into that thinking when we consider it? Andrew?
I think there are significant challenges. For example, in the world of self-sovereign identity, I've had occasion to enjoy myself by asking various regulators, in the case of a self-sovereign identity, who is the data controller? And there's this rather embarrassed silence. You know, GDPR is a wonderful way of protecting people's privacy and their data. And despite its challenges, I think it's a world gold standard, exceeded perhaps not only by the Canadians. But it leaves, you know, there's a regulatory gap to understand exactly how should verifiable credentials be managed. Similarly, in the world of anti-money laundering, there are great issues associated with what kinds of sources of data and to what extent can organizations be reliant upon third-party generated digital identities rather than financial institutions gathering what are considered primary identities today. At the moment, it's unclear. In Europe, for example, many of the financial regulators won't allow automated remote biometrics to be used for the establishment of what are effectively digital identities. They insist instead upon the use of agent-based video calls, which are now pretty much 10 years old and thoroughly obsolete and are subject to some extremely well-known and dangerous security flaws. Yeah. In the United States, things are changing as usual, faster than anywhere else. Digital Identity Act is coming through, Real ID is being implemented. But again, there are building blocks that still need to be put in place. Clarity more than anything to do with how to do with the degree in which organization A is entitled to rely upon assertions notarized by organization B. We are seeing trust frameworks developing. So the UK, for example, is developing a rather elegant and flexible trust framework. I think we're going to see something parallel happening.
I really think that the UK is leading there. Absolutely. They've created one of the most flexible environments.
I think Australia may actually be ahead even on that in that sort of area. But stuff is moving very quickly now.
It sounds like there is those wider levers. Rod, sorry, did you want to say something in addition?
Yeah, it is interesting how how messy it is and how fast the challenges are that are facing us are going at the same time. The capacity for people to do deepfakes, to get around many of the current systems that are out there today is frightening, and the cost to individuals for this is frightening. The stories that I hear for very simple attacks are they're easy to understand. I mean, we all see things, right? There's a danger in the weaponized anonymity that we see in the world today. Q was able to attack the Capitol in the US because Q is anonymous. The challenge that we're seeing elsewhere is simple stuff. Spear phishing that I know somebody personally who, for example, was posting very happily on social media that they were about to buy a new house. Somebody was able to find out what was going on between the couple, to send one of them an email saying, or a text message saying that they needed to act quickly to close the financing rate. There was a follow-up email that looked like it came from a title company. The deposit was wired, $500,000 gone. The FBI got involved. It's expensive. We see the same thing.
I think you make a very good point, Rod, because in America, 13 million people suffered from identity theft last year. In Europe, there are over 2 million money laundering mule accounts that have been set up, often in the name of completely innocent people. And I think you're right to emphasize this, because the societal harm that both money laundering, fraudulent money laundering mule accounts can create, and this personal suffering that identity theft creates is enormous. And yet the money that can be made by serious organized crime and state actors is enormous. And I think one of the real risks that we suffer in this industry at the moment is what I call good enoughism. Is the feeling that if it looks okay to Rod, does this look okay to you? Yeah, it looks okay. The regulator doesn't know any better. He'll swallow it. Let's go with that. It's not okay. People are up against serious organized crime, drug cartels, and secret services, and they have to recognize that if they don't take the threat seriously enough, people will be harmed.
It is personal too. It's not just the big cartels. It's the poor individuals who have gotten sucked into human trafficking situations and dreadful lives. It's grandma losing her retirement savings. It's both the big and the small. It's something that if we address it, we save a lot of people a lot of suffering.
I absolutely agree. It's a profound effect on the society as a whole, globally and per country, but also individuals. Which leads me on to my next question.
Sorry, Helen, if I can make the point. We have to get the balance. We have to get the combination. It's not a balance. The combination between good enough security to keep those bad guys at bay, to protect people and organizations against the intense pressure that these well-resourced organizations driven by compelling criminal business models are exerting, and the need to ensure that people can actually use this technology. Because if we say, okay, we're going to secure this and we're going to secure this until none of you can use it, that's not okay. Digital identity is ultimately about inclusion, and inclusion means usability. It means that people aged 9 to 90, whatever their cognitive ability, however expensive a device they can afford, whatever their ability, their facility with technology, everybody must be able to use these technologies. And it's not good enough to say, yes, I know we're torturing you, but it's for the good of society. We have to find and it's not the right balance, the right combination of strong security and excellent usability. And I'm afraid that's a particular passion of mine.
It's a good passion. One of my questions is about, and I'll go to Andrew first and Rod. How do you see the absence of digital identity structures, causing a problem, or perhaps not being absent? Because we can see that the need for the digital identity structure is profound, but how to close that gap?
Well, I think what's happening is COVID has transformed everything, because until COVID, you could say, well, there's no digital identity, but, send us the papers, turn up to the branch, turn up until you've got your documents, you can kind of turn up and do things. COVID swept all that away. And we've seen 3 or 4 years of progress towards digital identity concertinaed up into 1 year, because all of a sudden you couldn't do things unless you did them remotely and unless you did them online. So we've seen fantastic, we've seen things move forward with incredible rapidity. And what happens is you start off with a bit of disorder. You start off with lots of people trying out different things, and some of them succeed and some of them fail. You know what? That's okay, because nobody knows quite what the answer to this looks like. And a bit of evolutionary disorder in a number of markets is probably what we need in order to find out good solutions. What's interesting is verifiable credentials, a particular case. I mean, verifiable credential, the development of the W3C verifiable credentials work has been going on for what, 7 years? Everyone could see the potential of it. Everyone was excited about it. There were no implementations of it in the real world that I know of whatsoever. Come COVID, boom, suddenly you're starting to see COVID passports, COVID certificates, starting to use elements of verifiable credentials. You're starting to see organizations implement verifiable credential technology within their organizations, and you're starting to see national regulators like the European Commission starting to write what looks suspiciously like verifiable credential technology into their specifications for the next generation of digital identity. So it's accelerated this forwards. COVID has transformed the prospects for all of this happening quite markedly.
Thanks, Andrew. Rod.
Yeah, it's interesting. I studied economics when I was in undergrad and grad school, and it always, all the lectures began with, let's assume perfect information. That's the challenge, is that we don't have perfect information. Reviews that I see online for products are written by companies either hired by, or people hired by the company or hired by the competitor. That kind of misinformation, that kind of stirring of and muddying of the waters causes a lot of challenge. It undermines our ability to our actual economic order in very challenging ways. And if we can try and address these issues at that fundamental level, we can see tremendous results. That's why McKinsey is saying if we get digital identity right, we expect to see 3 to 6% increase in GDP. I mean, there's not a politician in the world who wouldn't be dancing on the rooftops if they managed to guarantee a 3 to 6% increase in GDP. So that's why I'm both passionate about this, but also concerned that we have a lot still to do. And I agree with Andrew that it's good enough's not good enough.
I mean, look, stuff is happening. In the United States, you're seeing the emergence of private organizations like Clear and ID.me, who are starting to deliver usable digital identities into the population. In the UK, we see that GDS is going to be providing a usable, workable single sign-on to the British government, and it's going to be part of a usable, workable trust framework, which we're going to see implemented probably by the middle of next year. In Europe, we're going to see AI-2, which is going to, I think, be pushed by the European Commission and create a new framework in Europe. In Canada, we're seeing DIAC pushing forward the architecture for digital identity across in the context of a number of rapidly moving initiatives by individual states. In Australia, MyGov ID is rapidly rolling out, and the national states are working within that same trust framework. In Singapore, you're seeing the extension of the use of SingPass, not just for government purposes, but now we recently discovered, for example, that iProov authentication was being used to enable users of the OCBC ATMs to get their pensions out of ATMs. That's a whole new expansion in the way in which a government identity is being used by private organizations. So we're seeing a lot of things happening in different parts of the world right now to move digital identity forwards.
It's the big pattern amongst most of these, though, is I believe is that from the user's perspective, not from the complexity of rolling it out. That's another matter entirely. But from the user's perspective, you are starting to find that you can have one digital identity solution that you can use in multiple locations. And that thing of centralizing it within the user's control, no matter of how it's delivered, is I think the biggest trend. That'll will I think accelerate. People will start to demand that whatever their one solution is, whether it's the Interact Verified Me in Canada, whether it's the Connect ID in Australia, or the Bank ID in Norway or Sweden, that one ID that you can then use in multiple locations is the big trend.
And touching upon the customer experience, we've talked about throughout today's session, both in terms of threats and changes with the pandemic and digital skills, or trying to understand it. But the customers are the key part to this actually happening. The acceptance, societal acceptance, individual acceptance, different demographics, different jurisdictions, and trying to accept this whole new world, which can be slightly overwhelming, slightly new. And I guess it'd be great to hear your thoughts on how to educate people to accept this as a consumer, and how the experience of using it and the trust all come together in this perfect package, which is where we want to end up with. I'll go to you, Rod, first.
I think Clear ID in the US is a great example of how to pull it together. People have to see an immediate benefit. So Clear is for people who don't know it, is a simple way of jumping the line at the airport. It costs, you have to spend almost $200 a year to be a member of the program. And they do a lot to recognize who you are, scan your passport, confirm who you are right at the beginning, but then you can go up to these kiosks and jump the line. It was probably higher demand when lines were more of a concern, and is now becoming higher demand as lines are returning in the US airports, which is good. But it's a great product. I've been a customer for years and love it. And I pay for it because it gives me this amazing advantage. I think that when people start to see that whatever these solutions are, if they are usable in multiple places and they make things faster and more convenient, people will adopt them.
I think that's absolutely right, Rod. You know, when we talk about user education, I'm always very suspicious when vendors or industry promoters talk about needing to educate the public. So that they will buy what we want them to buy. I don't think the public is interested in being educated, and I don't think it's necessarily our place to do it. It's exactly what Rod said. This is about coming up with powerful reasons why users' lives will be better if they do something. And if you do it exactly as Rod said, digital identity schemes in general are very hard to create because they're two-sided markets. In that way, they resemble sort of credit card arrangements. You've got the users and you've got the relying parties, you've got the merchants, and the users won't sign up unless there are compelling merchants, and the merchants won't sign up unless you've got lots of users. So they're terribly, terribly difficult things to get going. If you can come up with a use case that is compelling, like Bank ID in the Scandinavia, where it just made your life so much easier every time you wanted to open a new bank account, you don't have to educate the customers. You say, look, you can either use Bank ID and have a simple life, or you can choose not to use our Bank ID and have a terribly complicated and paper-living life. It's up to you. So this will all happen if we are able, if solutions are put. I mean, let me give you an example. In the UK, conveyancing, that is real estate transactions, are right pain in the neck, because there are lots of individual entities involved, all of whom have to do KYC. So there are lawyers, there are realtors, solicitors and real estate agents, in other words, and they all have to do KYC on you. So a number of companies have set up real estate passports, which are a dedicated, focused real estate transaction. Real estate digital identity. So you have to educate the customers. You say, look, if you want to make your life 10 times easier when selling your house and more secure, take this up. So organizations like Third Fort, for example, and ETIV, have signed up tens of thousands of customers, not by educating them on what's good for them, but by saying, look, by the use of this solution, which happens to be a sectoral focused digital identity, we can make your life a lot easier. And they come.
I think it's an interesting angle about trying to get the consumers to come, but there's also the points about the initiatives and the incentives for organizations to do. This doesn't cost 5 pence, and it certainly doesn't take 5 minutes. And so yes, there are many different incentives to organizations for different agendas. And it's trying to find an incentive that works for them, shall we say, for society, which is not necessarily where everybody comes from. And I guess, you know, to look to maybe Rod with your co-chair of the
Open Digital Trust Initiative. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. How you think about that, how to kind of push that initiative.
We look there too. I'm inspired by Norway and the Norwegians. The Bank ID there has achieved amazing things. 99% of the people use it. They use it about 200 times a year on average for each person. They have, by using it, they've reduced fraud rates from about 1% of digital transactions down to 0.00042% of transactions. They have made processing times on things like mortgages being reduced from 16 days down to 5 minutes. You can close a mortgage, fund it, have it all set up in 5 minutes. They actually had to pass a law to slow it down, a cooling off period, so that people could double check rather than clicking on the wrong ad and suddenly finding that they refinanced the house. It's amazing how powerful it's been. It's hard to get the data on what positive impact it's had on money laundering. But if it's had anything like even a 1/10 of the impact that it's had on fraud, it's radically reduced that also, and it's really improved things. For the participants in it, for consumers, it's a lot easier. It's a lot faster. They feel a sense of control. For the banks that provide it, it's revenue. It's a tighter relationship with their customers. For society as a whole, it's something that's much safer. And for merchants who are using it, they have radically reduced fraud. So you can see benefits for everybody across the spectrum.
Yeah. That's great. Thanks, Rod. And Andrew, over to you. Conscious we are running out of time, but I'd like to hear your closing thoughts on this angle.
So actually, one of the biggest problems in getting digital identity schemes going is, in fact, the business model. That there is no really well-established business model for digital identity as a trade, and that's actually been one of the rate limiting factors. But the individual elements of it, at least there are value benchmarks. So, for example, the process of automated remote onboarding, scan your identity document, iProov your face. That replaces an in-person identity verification, which can cost between 15 and 30 euros a time. So the incentive to go digital is a massive cost saving, as well as reduction in time from a couple of hours to 35 seconds, which is, I mean, the one of the first ever to do this was the UK Home Office, who enabled people to onboard to EU settled status for European citizens in the UK using an absolutely revolutionary mobile app, which completely transformed not just the user experience and the scalability, but also the cost fabric of doing that. So for remote onboarding, there's a huge cost incentive. In a lot of cases, today, the truth is that the way people authenticate is by using text messages, one-time passcodes, which, I mean, as I say, as you mentioned at the beginning, Helen, I founded what went on to become one of the world's largest SMS aggregators. So I know quite a lot about this. The nice thing is that is a cost factor, and modern methods of authentication can actually, such as genuine presence assured face verification, can deliver a better user experience more cheaply than that. So there are individual benchmarks in all of this. I'm conscious as we come to an end that some of you, many of the audience may be going, what does this mean to me? Am I going to set up a digital identity provider? No. But the truth is, you can't sit around waiting for Godot. You can't sit around waiting for digital identity to happen and solve all your problems. What's actually going to happen is that each organization which is responsible for knowing their customer is going to have to create their own little digital identity world for the time being. And what they can do is just to use modern technologies and such other digital identity schemes as they can find out there to do what ETIV and Third Fort have done, to create their own digital identity solution for their particular requirements, but just make it as easy and as secure as possible in the hope that maybe one day in the future, they can federate them, they can link up together, they can monetize it in new ways, and perhaps even they can dispense with the process of management and monitoring, because one day there will be a digital identity scheme out there they can use, but it's not today. Don't hold your breath. Go and build it for yourself now.
Well, I just want to say this has been a very insightful and invigorating conversation. And I thank Andrew and Rod very much for their knowledge, their time and their experience on this subject. And I hope that the participants have enjoyed this and will potentially watch this again, because I think we all learn a lot today. And I hope that you know, Andrew and Rod, we thank you very much for your time and energy today, and fingers crossed in 2022 we may see our vision that we set out at the very start on that journey to be realized.
Yes.
So
thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Helen.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.
Be well.